Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to The Real News. I'm speaking with Robert Scheer, one of the premier journalists, certainly one of the journalists I admire most in the United States, the editor of Truthdig, and I write a column for Truthdig for Bob. And we're talking about his new book, They Know Everything About You: How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy, which is a brilliant explication of the security and surveillance apparatus and the fusion of government and corporate power into every aspect of our lives. Let's begin a little bit about how this started, how it began.
Well, I think the surveillance state has been with us in one form or another. You just go watch the movie Selma and look at what was done to Martin Luther King. And I remember those days well. I was editing Ramparts magazine. We exposed the CIA. In turn, they went after us. We were audited. We were followed. Our office was broken into. And we published King. And I remember the way King began to be seen not as a convenient icon, but rather as a radical thinker. And it was particularly when he opened his support to SNCC, the younger radicals in the civil rights movement. And then when he came out against the Vietnam War, when he gave that speech, actually he did it before, but the most prominent was his speech at Riverside Church, where he condemned the U.S. government.
And he did because of photos you ran in Ramparts magazine.
Yeah, but he was going to do it anyway. He was moved, and he gave the reasons in his speech. It wasn't just those photos. It was, as he said in the speech, how can I go into the ghetto and tell young blacks to shun violence and to embrace nonviolence, and yet they're drafted to go fight in Vietnam, where, in his words, the U.S. government is the major purveyor of violence in the world today. So, you know, to have Martin Luther King reduced to a statue or a holiday as an inoffensive, benign figure is absurd. And what I tell my students when they say, oh, what does it matter if we give all this information to the government? Well, it does matter. Martin Luther King, if you had today's surveillance apparatus, Martin Luther King would have been destroyed.
Right.
Because in those days, you had to have somebody in the hotel room next to him listening or physically tapping into the phone, following him. And I worked in totalitarian countries. I was in the old Soviet Union. I was in Egypt after the Six-Day War and other countries. You know, you knew when you were being followed, or you could assume you would know when you're being followed, and you acted accordingly. But in with today's technology, you have the ability to know what book did Martin Luther King read, up to what page, and then who did he associate with. And then you can doctor it. You can make up a new profile. You can mix and match the data. I think of someone like Eliot Spitzer. Eliot Spitzer was probably from my point of view, the most promising progressive politician the Democratic Party had. As Attorney General and Governor of New York, he went after the banks. He was consistent. And what did they find? They find him with prostitutes in some situation. How? Because they have all the records, all of your financial transactions, every movement you made. And they want to destroy this guy who, you know, if you look at a movie like Wolf of Wall Street, evidently they all do cocaine and they all have prostitutes. So what Eliot Spitzer is accused of doing is rather minor. But on the other hand, it finished him, absolutely finished him. And so the things that changed, I wrote an article where the book began as I wrote an article in the late 90s for Yahoo Internet Life. I did a whole issue on privacy and the loss of privacy. And I was driven to do that because of the argument around the Financial Services Modernization Act, otherwise known as the act that reversed Glass-Steagall, that destroyed the main regulatory mechanism of the New Deal, that separated commercial and investment banks from insurance companies and so forth. And in the debate, not much of a debate, but those who opposed this devilish thing that Clinton had come up with, Phil Gramm, a Republican Democratic cooperative, that was what my last book was about, they were going to allow insurance companies with medical records and your most intimate medical to merge with commercial banks that are going to see whether you should have a loan, and with investment banks that knew about the rest of your activity. And all of this data was going to be merged, and a few sensible souls who understood something about the thirst for privacy in this country that goes back not just to the Fourth Amendment, but actually goes back all the way to the Magna Carta and English common law after that. People, a few of them raised this question: what happens to privacy when you're merging all this data at a time when you have supercomputers, when you can store this data, when you can sort through it, and so forth, and when people are surrendering more and more data. So I got interested in that, and at that time, and they emerged as kind of prescient, somewhat heroic figures. Somebody like Bill Safire, who I never thought I would write a book indicating any admiration for Bill Safire, who was Nixon's speechwriter, chief speechwriter, who then became a columnist for the New York Times. But he certainly sounded the alarm, and interestingly enough, sounded the alarm about too big to fail as well. When I went back and looked at his columns, it was privacy, but also why do we want these banks to be so big? So there was a little bit of the genuine libertarian free market idea, but he sounded the alarm on privacy. And he actually opposed not just that, but the total awareness state and all that stuff that was emerging. Ed Markey, who's now a senator from Massachusetts, was a younger congressman. He also raised this argument. And they said Bill Clinton should veto that bill for a number of reasons, but certainly on privacy. The banks, which had put in $300 million to get that legislation, said, no, you end our ability to merge this data. We don't care about merging. It's the data we want, so we can more effectively market. And what I came to realize then, that this internet, and I'm not a Luddite, I had an internet publication. I did my first year in graduate school. I worked on an IBM computer that was in a warehouse, had less power than my smartphone does now. I studied engineering originally in college. I like technology. I'm an early adapter for every gadget. And I do applaud the internet as a great educational tool. We used to talk about having to learn Esperanto or some artificial language to talk internationally. Now with the internet, we have instant translation. At Truthdig, we put up a Hedges article, and somebody in Shanghai could see it at night. Someone in Shanghai has just read it. Someone in Dublin has just read it. It's been translated automatically and so forth. So I applaud the internet as a great way. It used to be, as a teacher, I teach at USC, University of Southern California. If I get a kid interested in something, in the old days, they'd have to go to a major library in a major city to read something about what was Watergate or what was this. Now they get online. In a couple of hours, they know more than their parents do about Watergate or any other subject, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution or any other such thing. So I love the internet, but the enemy of the internet is something called targeted advertising. And it's the ability to sell stuff with an efficiency of a heat-seeking missile, because people surrender their personal information for convenience. And we increasingly have come to define the act of freedom as consumer sovereignty, not individual sovereignty, which was the basic notion of the American Constitution. We have the power as individuals, at least white males, yes, imperfect document, as Howard Zinn and others have pointed out eloquently, but at the heart of the Constitution was an incredible notion that power should begin with the individual, and that the individual then surrenders power to the common good, the state or federal government, but it is power that can be withdrawn, can be checked, checks and balances, division of power. And the odd thing is, that notion of limited government was put into the Constitution, and they accepted the Bill of Rights by people who were going to be the government. And basically, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, all said, watch us. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You need, it wasn't, when they put in the freedom of the press, they knew the press was scurrilous and mean and nasty. They knew speech could be mean and nasty, you know, Washington's a crook, a philanderer, whatever. You know, the terrible things were said about all these folks. And they knew when you assembled for a redress of grievances, you might be wrong, or you might be exaggerated in your claim of grievances. There were at least 1/3 of the people who opposed the American Revolution who were living here and thought these people were scoundrels. So they were going to be the government. And they empowered the citizenry to check that government, to challenge it fundamentally. After 9/11, and this was after I wrote that article for, or did the whole cover issue for Yahoo Internet Life, this event, which in the, you know, the threats facing nations was really not existential.
Right.
You know, we have the strongest military in the world, that's not going to be overthrown. But somehow, and compared to the founders, who after all, the English could come back, did come back, and they would be hanging from some tree. Nonetheless, after 9/11, this became the excuse for ramping up the surveillance state, unprecedented proportion. And I think that combined with the fact that you have the ability to sift through information and that the public volunteers all this information, presented a toxic mix which has threatened whatever hope we had for democracy at this point.
Although, of course, at this point, they have a lot of information we don't volunteer. It is true that we volunteer, but they have our medical records, they have arrest, you know, legal records, they have everything.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly the point of the book, and for two reasons. One, if this material was being volunteered and the process was transparent, and this was the issue in the objection of Sapphire and Markey and others to Glass-Steagall, they said if you're going to have people volunteer this information, this data you're going to be mining and merging, okay? It has to be totally transparent. And then when they know what you're doing, before you merge this data, you should have to be required, this company, whether it's Apple or Google or Facebook or anyone else, Chase Manhattan Bank, a Travelers Insurance, they should have to go back to the individual, because the individual should own that data, and it should have the opt-in principle. That sounds boring and archaic, you know, opt-in. It's very clear. And when people say we can't stop this, it's rubbish. You can stop it. If Bill Clinton had said, this is what Sapphire and Markey, I should have made this point, this is what they said, put in opt-in. Before Travelers, when they merge with Citibank and become, you know, the biggest bank in the world that then had to be bailed out by taxpayers, before they can merge that data, they should have to go back to you and say, you gave your medical records to Travelers, and now Chase is going to have it, okay, or Citi is going to have it. We have to ask you, do you give permission? That's called opt-in.
But in the book, you describe, you know, I think it's with Google, you know, or Facebook, where they create a mechanism by which you can click a box saying that you're not allowed to share this information. I mean, I have it technically correct, but they rewrite the rules so they can share it if they want to.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is what we've seen throughout both the legislative and the judicial process, that when there is any kind of an outcry, they essentially, once again, game the system by having a kind of facade, dealing with it in terms of, you know, rhetorically, but not substantially.
Right, and for the reasons the person that we both admire, Ralph Nader, makes clear, there is no real consumer protection.
Right.
So we have this false notion of consumer sovereignty. To have real consumer sovereignty, even if we assume that's the only area where freedom should matter, which it shouldn't, we should care about political freedom and, you know, social freedom and so forth, but a robust notion of consumer sovereignty should mean that you have transparency, you know what's done with your data, you know how you're being manipulated, and whether you agree to it. And that, you know, was the idea. And I don't want to lose track of that, because when they say, oh, you can't do anything about it, or the cat's out of the bag, nonsense. If right now our government were to say, no, you cannot mine data, you cannot mix it, you must go back to the consumer and have their permission, They've given some medical center their data. No, you can't sell that data to a third party. You can't use it for your affiliate. You have to go back and say, we're going to use your medical record to give it to the banks to decide whether you're a good risk on a loan. Well, most people would say, no, I don't want you to do that. And what we have instead is this opt-out thing. If you should learn that your data is being used, maybe you could write a letter, maybe something would happen. So we don't have transparency. We don't really have an honest connection between the consumer and these companies. That's true. But what Edward Snowden did, and the reason he's one of the most important individuals to emerge in modern American history, is that the courage of this 29-year-old at the time in turning over this massive amount of data made it irrefutable that this government has destroyed the notion of the free market. That's what is being ignored by the people who call Snowden a traitor. I think Snowden provided this incredibly and valuable educational service to say there is no private sector, that the private and the government are merged.
Right.
This is the military-industrial complex with a vengeance that Eisenhower warned about, but now it's a military intelligence complex. And, you know, the internet was formed by DARPA, by the Defense Department. The original purpose of the internet was, in the event of a nuclear war, to have redundancy in communication. How do you communicate when the nuclear explosions are going off? So it can't be a centralized system. The internet is built on a decentralized system to withstand an attack, okay? However, it was learned it's a great means of communication. It had a robust life. It's expanded. But the main reason it's expanded is because it's a great source of profit, not for those who produce content, whether it's the New York Times or Truthdig. We're all hurting. You know, anyone who produces plays or writes poems or music, we're all hurting, all of us out there. But it's a great source of profit for the aggregators. Why? Google, you know, Facebook, so forth, because they get this data. They get your private data, and they can do the targeted advertising. So you're reading an article about shoes, and suddenly there are ads for shoes. And then, oh, that's a customer we want. We can find out where they go, where they live, how they shop, how much money they have, and you have this heat-seeking missile of targeted advertising. Okay. That was acceptable to most of the world's consumers as long as they thought it was totally in the private sector. Yeah, it's nice to know what restaurant is near me. It's good to know what shoes are being sold. That even seems like a bargain. But when you mix that, all that data, and you say, as Edward Snowden revealed, that that's all available to the government, whether Google wants it or not, we can argue about the degree of complicity. But there's no question after Snowden that there are no barriers to the government grabbing that data. They go under the ocean and cut into fiber optic cable and scoop it all up. They set up dummy cell stations and listening posts all over the world. They go through the backdoor channel Google. They implant, so we now know SIM cards that are in everything, every phone, everything, that we've had billions of SIM cards phonied up, and so they're in people's phone. And so even when the phone is off, it becomes a mechanism for spying on you in your bedroom, in your most intimate meetings. If you want to talk to people about maybe joining Occupy or joining the Tea Party, they can spy on your meeting. So what we've had is actually a subversion of this very exciting technology, which could bring people together and communicate, and turns it into a spying mechanism. And the irony right now is that because it threatens, once Snowden revealed this, the intimate relationship between these big internet companies and the government, which I discuss in the book, right up to the highest level, once Snowden revealed it, it became untenable in the eyes of many people in the world. Less so in this country, because we have a really distorted view of government as opposed to the concerns of the founders that we should regard government with suspicion. We've now been propagandized to think of government as benign and only protecting us against terrorists and so forth. But most of the world will not see that way. They see an American company that claims to be a multinational, claims to be above national. That's what a multinational is. You know, they're rising to a higher purpose, at least the higher purpose of selling us stuff all over the world, so they have to be loyal to consumers all over the world. Well, if they're just a puppet of the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, why should anyone in Germany trust those little Google trucks to ride around all your neighborhood taking the pictures of your houses so that those pictures can show up back in all over the United States? Well, what does the FBI do with those pictures? Right. Or they're photographing your biometrics, or you buy an iPhone 6 and you give the thumbprint.
Right.
You know, hundreds of times a day, every time you buy a book, every time you go to a movie, every time you have a meal, and then your thumbprint is compared to other people's thumbprints, and you have people, you know, they have the most inclusive evidence of every moment of your life, everything you're doing, and correlating it now with supercomputers and vast data storage. The haystack is infinite,
right.
Okay? And as people like William Binney and Drake and Thomas Drake and others have pointed out, is woefully inefficient as far as stopping terrorism or
well,
so forth.
That's not why it's designed.
Yeah, it's not why it's designed.
We're going to come back with part 2 with this interview with Robert Scheer, the author of They Know Everything About You. So please join me for part 2 with Robert Scheer. Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Chris Hedges, and this is part 2 of my interview with the author Robert Scheer, who wrote They Know Everything About You, his brilliant study of the security and surveillance apparatus and how we got there. In this book, Bob, you begin, at least from my reading of it, by positing that the security and surveillance apparatus really began as a commercial enterprise, primarily, and that government then came in, then saw what was going on, saw its usefulness in terms of the data collecting, and came in later. Would that be?
Yeah, at first it was really a boondoggle of the Defense Department. You know, we're going to have, if we have nuclear war, first of all, if we have nuclear war, there is no life, so there's nothing to do. But the idiots that were talking about mutual assured destruction in the Defense Department and how do you fight a nuclear war, and said, well, the first thing that's going to go is the communication system, you know, electromagnetic impulse and all of the other things that happen when you set off these bombs. So we won't even be able to talk. We won't be able to tell our plane, you can't make the rubble, radioactive rubble dance unless you move over to this position. There's still some surviving person in the Ukraine or something you got to take out. And so they had this idea, how do we have redundancy in communication? And the whole idea of the internet is a system that's decentralized. You know, and that has turned out to be the wonderful thing about it. It can be added on, it can be factored in, it can meet the situation in different countries, and we know that. That's the great thing. And so suddenly the Cold War was over, you really didn't have much reason for it, and meanwhile the internet was out there, and the reason it was out there was that the people who want to sell stuff came to understand that in fact it was the great marketplace. And the reason was that before the internet, when you were a newspaper or broadcast television or what have you, you could only guess at the impact of your readership on sales. You know, I worked for the LA Times for 29 years, and my wife was even a vice president and in a much higher position. And they would tell people on Auto Row or in the movie business, take out these full-page ads, and you're going to have people go to the movies this weekend, or they're going to buy cars. And broadcast television, it was the same thing. We have all these eyeballs, and they're going to watch this, and they'll buy stuff. But it was really an inexact science, indeed a fraudulent one. You know, your Nielsen ratings and your surveys and focus groups, they basically were lying to the advertisers about who you could deliver. You could, you know, newspaper, did they buy it for fish wrap? Did they buy it for the sports section? Did they buy it for the classified ads? And yet, you know, you were claiming millions. You worked at the New York Times, I worked at the LA Times. But the economic model was based on kind of a phony, certainly inexact science of who's
Oh, it was a scattershot.
Yes. And what the internet did is suddenly you had information on who these people are. You started to see, you could know their most intimate habits, their emails, their shopping habits, their networks, particularly once social networking and things like Facebook developed, who their friends are, and so forth. And they were willing, these people out there who were doing Google searches or on Facebook, to surrender voluntarily an enormous amount of information that you never had before about their age and their marital status and their sex life and their dress size and whether they're bald or have a lot of hair or taking different medicines. I mean, the most intimate knowledge of people, not just in the United States, but all over the world. You have this incredible data, and then you were able to target your advertising to get these people. And not only could you get them in the sense that you could find out if they went to an ad, clicked on to that ad, but you could find what they did with it. Did they tell somebody about it? Did they ask for more information? And the killer app of all, did they buy something? And what were they satisfied with it? And then you could retarget them. And so this heat-seeking missile of targeted advertising turned out to be a source of incredible profit, not for the producers of art and books, or news articles. The New York Times is in deep trouble, even though it's still a very important paper. Why? Because the advertisers don't really need to go to the New York Times. Once they got the readers, and they got them in other databases, they can mine that data.
Well, it broke that monopoly because newsprint had, for almost a century, a monopoly connecting sellers with buyers.
Right.
And that's what the internet did, and that is why newsprint is withering away as quickly as it is. And classified, as you know, was 40% of most newsprint revenue.
Right.
And that immediately switched to the internet.
Right.
But there's something else about the internet. It's not just about surrendering information. You now have large corporations. Not only does the government have profiles, but large corporations, it's a huge multi-billion-dollar business, have profiles on us. So if we go to apply for a job, you can pay one of these corporations and you get an entire profile. They have everything on us, stuff that we couldn't even imagine that they have. So it's not just about connecting advertisers with consumers. But it is now, this data mining has become an independent business in itself.
Sure, and the reason people have done that, if a government, any government in the world, had asked for this kind of, required this kind of information, okay? How far did you read in that book? What movie did you go to? Who did you have dinner with? The information that is gathered up now by the so-called private sector, that would be considered the most totalitarian, invasive, coercive, threatening model, right? I mean, this is something the Stasi in East Germany couldn't, presume. I mean, this was something Stalin never dreamed of. It's something Hitler or Goebbels could not dream of, this kind of knowledge and following and the movement and the action and the thoughts, and then being able to manipulate it. After all, in my book, I describe Facebook's experiment in giving you cheerful news and depressing news. And, we know, whether it's Barack Obama or George W. Bush, they now do very effective political advertising. They can get this data, and then they can target these people.
Well, the advertising is different depending on who you are.
Right. And
just the same, and I think you also mentioned about news stories.
Yes.
I mean, they develop a profile of your habits, and then they feed those habits.
Right, and they can manipulate those habits, whether it's taste or political direction or so forth. But so what happened was that in the private sector, this became a source of enormous profits, not for the artists, though. We have to remember that, not for the news gatherers, not for the people doing the hard work, but for people who want to sell stuff.
Right.
And they could grab this data through Google searches or Facebook or so forth. So the people really making the money are not the people who are going to support journalism or the arts, right? Book publishing is in trouble. Amazon may get the word out there, but they rip off the money. But the main money being made is being made by, without you really knowing it, exploiting your data. Now, again, if that were really a transparent activity and it remained in the private sector, you could see that as a matter of individual choice. If you really want to give Facebook all of this information and allow it to be marketed and so forth, okay, that's your stupid decision, but maybe you have the right to make that stupid decision. When you don't know what's happening with the data, then you're not an informed consumer.
But it even goes beyond that, because if you go down to the pharmacy and run your credit card through, they immediately know what medicine you've bought, and that goes to your profile. That's not giving it up.
Right.
I mean, we have gone far beyond the voluntary. It is far more sophisticated than that,
right,
and far more intrusive.
Of course, yes, and that's why it's important to have laws that protect our right to our data, to know what's happening to our data. But what changed in this picture, and has alarmed people, and it bears repetition, is the connection between the private sector and the government. And as a result, thanks to Edward Snowden, and there were other whistleblowers, William Binney and Thomas Drake and others, but Edward Snowden occupies a unique place in my mind of respect and decency and courage, that he led us on the fact that we have what our founders, the framers of our Constitution, feared. Okay, our protection in the Bill of Rights does not really do much to protect us in the private sector. It is aimed at protecting us against government overreach, totalitarian government. Because if the government allows you no zone of privacy, then you have this thing that humans have feared throughout their history.
But we have no zone of privacy. I mean, we have no zone of privacy.
And the reason we have no privacy is if the government had demanded this information, we would know it's a totalitarian government. What happened here, this intellectual sleight of hand, is that increasingly the government was grabbing this data from the private sector, and the private sector was complicit. If you look at, in my book, for instance, I trace Google's connection with the Pentagon, and the top people at Google being on the top Pentagon
and then when they're exposed, they're all saying
yes. And so what changed was not suddenly the private sector was stricken by conscience. Hey, we're party to betraying the Fourth Amendment. We're party to enslaving the American people. We're party to destroying the most precious. I begin my book by saying, when it comes, privacy is the ball game. For freedom, because if you don't have a zone where you can collect your thoughts, where you can talk to friends, where you can organize, where you can think the different idea. Just take something Tea Party people, Ron Paul have thought about. Should the Federal Reserve be abolished? Okay, and you're having a discussion in your living room. But if your cell phone has been turned into a listening device, whether it's on or off, because the government has grabbed a SIM card and given you a phony one and hardwired it, okay, and is recording this whole conversation, and you're talking to your neighbors, and you say, why do we have a Federal Reserve? Oh, the Federal Reserve, as the Tea Party people, many believe, and as Ron Paul and Rand Paul and other libertarians have believed, oh, the Federal Reserve really just serves the banks and rips us off and, steals our money and prints money to make our things worthless and so forth. We should abolish the Federal Reserve. It's an agency of totalitarianism. Okay, and you're having that conversation. That conversation is being recorded by the NSA, by the CIA, which we know, FBI, and they've got this data, and they say, oh, in this really dangerous meeting that took place in this home in Texas, these people were plotting the end of the Federal Reserve. Now, in that profile, they don't say they're plotting the end of the Federal Reserve by voting for a congressman who would abolish it. No, you can then add other information. Oh, I read this book by Ayn Rand, or I read this book or that book. These people are plotting to blow up the Federal Reserve.
Well, what happens, all of the great writers of totalitarianism have written on mass surveillance, Hannah Arendt being one in The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she says that when you collect data on every single citizen, it's no longer about crime or justice, or it is about having materials so that when you criminalize a certain category of people, and Stalin was kind of the master of this, you can instantly arrest them because there's always something. And they can exactly do what you've done, where you take that rather innocent discussion and twist it to serve the ends of the state. That's the danger of mass surveillance. One of the things in your book is that you, I think you chronicle brilliantly, as I've said, the apparatus and how it works. And And yet I would argue with you that we already live in a corporate totalitarianism that has extinguished any idea of democracy. Now, this security and surveillance is so pervasive, and it was, of course, as you said, exposed by Snowden, but it's not implemented because they don't need it. It is used very effectively against those who carry out dissent. We saw it in the Occupy movement. So for instance, because everyone in Occupy communicated electronically, afterwards they knew who the engines of Occupy were, and they have gone back and used that data to slap them with felony convictions, usually for crimes they didn't commit, put them on probation for 5 years, so that if they do any kind of activism, they have to serve the sentence and they're locked up, effectively neutralized. So they've, and I've watched in New York, and I was close enough to the Occupy movement to tell you they went after the right people. We live in a period where we don't have hyperinflation. We're not convulsed by catastrophic effects of climate change yet. But the moment that comes, the mechanism is in place so that it's just the flick of a switch, isn't it? I mean, is there, at this point, is there really any going back?
Well, there is going back for a number of reasons. One is that what we do, our government does, can be done by any government. We're setting a standard for the world. And in fact, if one of the great things about having somebody like William Binney, who worked in the NSA for 36 years, he's the guy, for people who don't know, where they broke into his house. His wife had worked for the NSA for 26 years. So this is, and he had been, before he was in the NSA, he was in the military for 4 years during the Vietnam War era. He was in the Army, and then he goes into the NSA for 36 years. So he's a good Boy Scout. And he believed in all this, right?
So he designed the system.
He designed the system and so forth. But he designed a system called Thin Thread, which at least preserved privacy, respected the Fourth Amendment, and so forth. That system was taken over after 9/11 and, distorted into something that became this vast spying network. His wife had worked for the NSA for 26 years. I only bring that up because when the FBI, 12 FBI agents, blasted into his home and pointing guns first at his son, and then at his wife, and then he's in the shower, and there they are pointing guns right at his face, right, without any basis whatsoever. No, he's never been charged with anything, okay? Never been charged with anything. Terrorized, Why? Because he didn't even do anything like Snowden. He went to a congressional committee and said they're wasting money. They're not doing due diligence. We have, they're spending.
Well, and they're creating a system to spy on everyone.
And and he was a genuine, basically a conservative person who believed in limited government. That government is not supposed to spy. So but he has been a translator for us of what these slides that Snowden revealed tell us. He's one of the important translators. I'm speaking out of some knowledge because he just was at the University of Southern California, where I teach for 4 days, telling graduate students and everything how it works. And it was incredible eye-opener, even after I've written this book, because he said, look, here's one of these slides shows the degree of cooperation. So these are where we have these partnership agreements with Saudi Arabia, okay?
With Israel.
With Israel, with Egypt, all of these countries. Okay, but let's take Saudi Arabia, for example. That means if there's some Saudi dissident who's criticizing the Saudi Arabian government, and he's living in Detroit, or she's living in Cleveland, that our government is cooperating with the Saudi government to give them information on these dissidents living here. We had the Arab Spring. We had people in Egypt protesting for freedom. We've now forgiven the military junta that came back in power. We now give aid. Well, we're cooperating with them on intelligence. So any Egyptian anywhere in the world, whether they're in exile or at home, and they're writing critically about the military dictatorship of Egypt, our government, collecting all this data, is cooperating with the secret police there.
We know that they are collecting data on American citizens who are not dual nationals and giving it to countries like Israel.
Yes. But let me just
we're going to go on, Bob. So I'm just going to stop here. This is the end of part 2. This is Chris Hedges. For The Real News, I've been speaking with Robert Scheer on his book about the security and surveillance state, called They Know Everything About You. Thank you very much, Bob, and please join us for part 3. Hi, I'm Chris Hedges for The Real News. Welcome to part 3 of my interview with Robert Scheer, the author of They Know Everything About You: How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. So let's begin a little bit with the nature of totalitarianism. I would certainly argue that, when government has the capacity to watch you 24 hours a day, then you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship between a master and a slave. It doesn't matter whether they use this power at the moment. They are certainly using it against people, Muslims, Occupy dissidents, environmental activists, and others. But they have that capacity now to use it against all of us should they decide to use it. The storage of all of our personal information, this is the classic or even the core definition of a totalitarian system, where you have the ability, should you decide to criminalize an entire group of people, we spoke about that in part 2, as Hannah Arendt mentioned, to instantly sweep them up. And you, in part 2, talked a little bit about a kind of innocent discussion about the Federal Reserve. That's a kind of a very good example of how that happens. I don't share your optimism. I think that we're already there. I think that at a moment of crisis, whether that's environmental, whether that's financial, whether that's an act of catastrophic domestic terrorism such as 9/11, these people are totally ready to go. And I would also want you to address a little bit, at this point, is there really a difference between corporate and governmental power? I would argue that at this point they're completely fused.
Okay, so let me take the first part. I think the founders of our country understood exactly what you said before, and that any government has the capacity to become coercive, destructive, in the extreme. And they were talking about themselves.
Right.
And we should remember that the people who framed this debate in the Constitution had once admired the monarchy in England because they thought it was tempered by the Magna Carta, it was tempered by common law, it was tempered by restraint. And yet they felt the wrath of this king when the colonies started to rebel, and they drew a very important lesson from it. But they had already learned that lesson from the collapse of the Roman Republic, Athens to some degree, Greece, Spain, France, and they drew 2 basic points, I think. One is that you cannot be a republic and empire in the same moment. That if you are going to have meddled in the affairs of people throughout the world, foreign entanglements and so forth, you can't be a representative republic. That you will be lied to routinely in the name of patriotism. George Washington, in his farewell address, a document I would commend to anyone to read, something he spent 8 years thinking about because he was going to be a one-term president, and then he kept it in his drawer, and it wasn't an address given obviously on radio or television, but it was printed, and he consulted with Hamilton and Madison about it prior to his leaving after 8 years, and it's a very thoughtful document. And first of all, it basically argues that if the decisions that you expect people to make politically in a republic are not close to home, if they don't have information, if they're not informed, then it's not going to be a meaningful exercise. That the trick in representative government is not the vote itself. It's how well informed the public is. So that those women in Iraq who held up their purple-stained fingers, voting the way the Ayatollah ordered them to vote, that's obviously a parody of democracy. But so too is our current situation, where a fear of an enemy, whether it was communism, as a monolithic, inherently expansionist phenomena, or terrorism as an undifferentiated threat, unexamined, lied about weapons of mass destruction and so forth. It makes this whole idea of representative government a parody. It's nonsense. And you have to, so the assumption of founders is you have state of freedom is something that has to be nurtured. It's fragile. People are not normally in a free situation. They were constructing a government and writing down rules for this government precisely because they thought it would wither. Remember Jefferson's idea, you're going to need a revolution periodically to fertilize the tree of liberty.
Let me just throw in there, Bob. I mean, they also recognized the importance of the press, the Fourth Estate, as a vital counterweight. And through the security and surveillance apparatus, we have no mechanism anymore to investigate the centers of power. We cannot shine a light into the centers of power.
Right. So, but because of that, a sense of a foreign threat. So we have to just deal with that first of all. And when they put in these freedoms, they didn't put them in as a luxury, something you could only have in the best of times when you have no enemy. On the contrary, they were in an incredibly vulnerable position themselves. They just come through a revolution. They knew the English could return. They knew they had other foreign enemies. And yet they enshrined these protections not because freedom is a luxury in the best of times, but a necessity in the worst of times. That you will not have truth drive out error. You will not, as Washington warned, the impostures of pretended patriotism. You will not be able to stop these very same folks, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, from being bad people if you don't have the power of the people to check them. Okay, so that was absolutely critical to their whole evaluation. The other is that people have to be given a zone of protection for their ideas and their effects. That's what the Fourth Amendment was about. That if you are just observed all the time, if you're out there and can't collect your thoughts, can't think the unpopular thought, can't read what you can, you will not be free people. It's the basic condition. And they understood or anticipated exactly what happened in Germany. You mentioned Hannah Arendt, who was famous for having talked about the banality of evil. And if I were to talk about the current situation in that historical context, we have reduced the exercise of representative government to the most banal. We argue usually on an uninformed basis. We don't know what's really being done in our name with drone strikes or invasions, or the dictators that we support around the world were lied to with impunity. Going back to the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, I happened to write one of the first stories about it when they finally declassified a document showing there hadn't ever been a second Gulf of Tonkin, and the government knew at the time, and the government lied to us at the time. We recently, while I was writing this book, finally they declassed the smoking gun document. The media didn't even pay much attention to it on the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in the early 50s. And it was clearly established it was done by our CIA at the behest of the British intelligence, acting on the request from the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which is now known as BP production, and say, we have to get rid of this guy Mossadegh. We know he's not an agent of the Russians. We know he's not an enemy in any way, but he's threatening to hurt our profit in the oil business. So, but if you didn't have that information, you thought, oh, there's this dangerous guy in Iran. We got to get rid of him. And then we get the Shah, and we got to get, he's having some problems. And then now we got the Ayatollah. Where did he come from? Where did madness come from? Where did chaos come from to the Mideast? Oh, well, maybe these are monsters of our own creation. Maybe we are the ones.
Like ISIS.
Yeah, or like Al-Qaeda to begin with. We recruited these maniacs to go fight a basically secular government that happened, or we thought was too cozy with the Soviets. So these are monsters. Well, if you don't have that information, the electoral process doesn't mean anything. Then you add in the power of money to corrupt it and distort the agenda and manipulate, and it becomes a charade. So then you asked me before, how could I dare be optimistic? And the reason I'm optimistic is that, one, I think people throughout the world have embraced the notion of freedom and individual sovereignty. And that there is pushback from so-called ordinary people. And we did see it with Occupy. We do see it in a revived labor movement in some ways. You know, we see it with immigrant groups, Latinos demanding their rights, undocumented people. But we see it all over the world. We saw it in the Arab Spring. We see that, you know, actually freedom, liberty, are not abstractions. It's a part of being alive. You are a person of the church. Your father was a minister. You, I think now you are technically a minister, yes. Right? So the whole notion that we all have a soul, that the soul is to be held accountable by an almighty, that the soul has to, decisions are made, that the soul can be sacrificed, that ethics and morality are something individuals have to struggle about. Well, the struggle in the eyes of an almighty don't mean anything if we don't have an informed decision, if we aren't aware of what's being done. You know, we go along with torture, we go along with oppression because we are lied to, you know. So these become real issues for people. What did I know? How do I know it? And we have true heroes. Where do people like Daniel Ellsberg, who gave us the Pentagon Paper, or Edward Snowden, or Bill Binney, these people, absolute heroes. Jessica Lynch, who was pictured by the Defense Department as a Rambo figure fighting off the enemy, and then she wrote a book, a courageous book, in which she said, no, the government our government manipulated me. Pat Tillman, who the football player, you know, great career, and his brother Kevin, who was a professional baseball player, and they volunteer to fight Al Qaeda, and they go, and he's killed in friendly fire, and the whole thing is lied about by the government. Well, my wife Narda Zucchino did a book with Mary Tillman, Pat Tillman's mother, and Mary Tillman said, I'm not going to settle for your lies. My son was killed, and you tried to exploit him for propaganda purposes. He was killed with American bullets, not by this enemy. And she has, for years, tried to get to the truth of the matter. So people push back. People embrace liberty. It turns out this may be the most normal condition of human beings, where they feel best, okay? And that's why even now in this very manipulated and you know, controlled society, we play with the images of freedom through shopping, through choice, and so forth. We entertain people to death with free choices, what movie,
well, and the facade of our electoral system.
Yeah, that's true. But the reason, aside from that, I think people do have a thirst for freedom, and that, you know, that this is worldwide. People do want to throw off the shackles of dictatorships. And we've covered totalitarian countries, the two of us. And we know the reason you have dissidents, the reason you have people rebel, is they don't want to be controlled. When I would visit the old Soviet Union, one of the healthy things about it is that I never met anyone, even if they were a loyal member of the Communist Party, who told them Pravda, which his name means truth, told them the truth. They knew they were being controlled. We have a different problem in our society, is that this is all wrapped in the cover of freedom and so forth. So we are lied to in a much more effective way. We know that. Now, why am I optimistic? I'm optimistic because we live in a world in which capitalism has moved to a different stage, and it no longer can be contained within the bounds of a nation. As long as we could have our big companies we are 6% of the world's population, but we got 70% of the world's resources. As long as we're the only ones who could make stuff and we could sell it internationally. We had a model of exploitation and sales and so forth, where you could be loyal totally and under the subservience of your own government or in partnership with your own government, and go ahead and rip off the rest of the world. That's what the English did when they ripped off the oil of the Mideast. That's what we did when we sold stuff all over the world and invaded countries with impunity. But that's not the model we have anymore. The nation state itself is an anachronism in the eyes of many people. And what we have are these multinational corporations that have gained credibility by pretending to be totally independent, free-form institutions. And, you know, so GE, which was once the most American of companies, and, you know, and so the flag could be wrapped around. No, 2 out of 3 of GE's jobs are abroad, most of their activities abroad, and so forth. This was true, you know, obviously of the auto companies, most clear of the information companies, the Facebook and Apple and so forth. Their growth has to come internationally. This market is saturated. And they have to have so in China, for instance, right now, 3 of the top 10 information companies, internet, are Chinese. Now, how is Google going to penetrate that market? The Chinese government tries to keep them out, and they could say, hey, they're agents of the NSA, they're agents of the CIA. So they play the nationalism card. Google tries to say, no, you can trust us. We really care about the people we're serving. So same with Apple, Facebook, Mozilla, Instagram, so forth. You have what somebody like Marx wrote about as a contradiction of capitalism. And you can't be both. You can't claim that, hey, we want to go into China and photograph all your houses and hire all your people and sell you all this stuff. And we can do it. It doesn't matter that we're an American company. We're doing it for the interests of the Chinese people, our customers. And that's true in India, and that's true in Brazil, right? Oh, did we tap the phone of the elected leader of Brazil? Oh, did we tap the personal phone of the elected leader of Germany? Oh, did we interfere in your domestic politics? That wasn't us. That was the NSA. Okay, that was the CIA. Oh, they were using our data. So suddenly the cat was out of the bag. This was the value of Edward Snowden, but it would have come out anyway. Ultimately, it was coming out. And the fact is, wait a minute, Google, Apple, Facebook, you guys are really not independent multinational companies. You're actually old-fashioned agents of your own state government. You are in cahoots with them. You are wedded to them. They grab all this data. And therefore, you're spying on us. Why should we go with you? We'll go with a domestic. We'll go with the devil we know, a domestic company. Right now, the main pushback we're getting are not from liberal democratic politicians. They're not from people who claim they're interested in privacy on that end. They're coming from these multinational corporations. It's irony. If you look at where a section of my book is reprinted, like on Salon or on Truthdig, there'll be an ad from Google at the bottom. From Google, not a Google AdSense ad selling you soap or something or a car. No, saying we have to save the internet. We have to control the NSA.
You deal with that in the book. I mean,
yes, but the interesting thing is this is real because their business model is threatened by these disclosures. If it could have been kept secret, that'd be something else. But once it's out and people around the world know, so your biggest challenge right now, if you're sitting there at the top of Google, these enormously powerful, wealthy companies, you're getting pushback from the European Union.
Do you believe them?
Do I believe that they're concerned?
Do you
Yes.
think that they will actually separate themselves from the security and surveillance apparatus?
Well, if they don't, then they will decline.
Well, I asked Benny once if he encrypted, and he started laughing because I had been speaking back and forth through encryption to another country, and they would only speak to me through encryption. And I said, Bill, I think when I send an encrypted message, it's probably read faster than another message. And he agreed. He said, I don't encrypt. He said, and Julian Assange has said the same thing in cyberpunks. That he said, in the short term, you can use mechanisms to stop them, but in the end, we have created the most efficient mechanism to create a worldwide dystopia.
Well, first of all, let me disagree. And you should have Benny, and we'll talk to him. But I think his position is a little different than, as I indicated to you, I listened to it for the last 4 days.
Right.
There's two things. First of all, what they're doing is not efficient if the goal is to stop terrorism or
It's
anything.
not the goal.
Yeah.
That's not the goal.
But I mean, if the goal is to really do targeted...
But that's not the goal. You know it's not the goal.
Okay, I agree. Okay. But the other thing is, if your purpose is to, okay, so you're going to accept this not to get the bad guys. It's just to observe all of us, right? I'll agree with that. Okay, so let's take that. That puts you in opposition to what these companies are doing. And I'll give you a concrete example. Apple and Google and Facebook have all taken strong positions that they want to encrypt all of this mail. Okay. Now, if your goal is to observe everything we're doing and not just find some bad guys, that makes it maybe too expensive to do.
Thank you very much, Bob. This is the end of part 3 of my interview with Robert Scheer, the author of They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. I'm Chris Hedges for The Real News, and we'll be back with part 4 of my conversation with Robert Scheer. Thank you, Bob. Hi, I'm Chris Hedges for The Real News. Welcome back to part 4 of my discussion with Robert Scheer about his book, They Know Everything About You: How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. Let's get into this issue that we discussed at the end of part 3 about the reaction on the part of private corporations, Google, Apple, and others, because the exposure of their complicity with the security and surveillance state, which, as you point out, is global, hurts their business model. They are beginning to create systems of encryption. And whether you think that that will be an effective check on this intrusion of the security and surveillance apparatus into our personal lives.
I think it's a real eye-opener for them. And I think there'd been this incredibly naive notion in Silicon Valley. A lot of the research for this book was done talking to people. And somehow they were the libertarians unleashed. And the government was made up of fuddy-duddy people, and they didn't really understand modern technology. And they were creating a new culture, a new world in which people get to see all kinds of ideas and think all sorts of thoughts and everything. And, you know, the price of that is you still had to be nice to these government folks for a number of reasons. You wanted tax breaks. You wanted them to intervene with foreign governments. You wanted military contracts. You know, after all, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post, he's now building the big cloud that is going to contain our information for the NSA and the CIA. So they are complicit. There's a profit sector in government. They are using basically a military creation, which was the internet to begin with. So there was a weird relationship. And in the book, I document how, you know, Sergey Brin and others at Google went off to big meetings and had highest clearance and, you know, were complicit in all this. But they sort of had the illusion that, first of all, they get away with it, that no one would ever know. But also the guys in government are kind of, you know, they're beyond the thing. They don't really get it. They don't really know what's going on. They're really not that ominous. I think culturally they don't like them. They think people, particularly when they counted Cheney and torture and all of these, you know, gross things that the government was doing, they don't think that's productive. After all, they operate all over the world and get along with lots of different people. But I think they kidded themselves about the power relationship. You know, who has the power here? And we learned there was a company, Quest, and the guy who was running it, traditional capitalist, he said, no, I'm not going to cooperate. And he was destroyed.
He was destroyed.
Destroyed, faced with jail and so forth.
They wanted him to turn over his...
They wanted him to turn over the data.
And that was the service that Snowden used.
Yes, he used that, sir. And he said, no, this is a violation of my obligation to my customers and integrity and so forth. And they smashed him.
But isn't that an indication?
Well, there's no question that and this was, you know, if you want to go back to Germany, I mean, there were people at BMW and Mercedes, you know, and others that thought they could control fascism. This was always the illusion in that corporate government alliance. You know, actually, there were even some parallels with the Soviet Union. After all, Arnold Hammer, you know, who did Occidental Petroleum, originally was cooperating with Lenin, developing pencil factories and everything. So, you know, they've always had the illusion, it's the illusion in Iran, that, you know, oh, we could actually work with the Shah and we can work with all these totalitarian leaders. And at some time, no, they turn on you. And so I think that's what happened in this connection. And I think the pushback from these companies, it'll only go so far. I mean, they can be, you know, because the feds have a lot of power. The feds can go after your taxes. The feds can intimidate you. They can blackmail you. I mean, this information can also be mined to do in the head of Apple, right?
Of course.
You know, Tim Cook, what movies did you watch, and so forth. So it's really,
but that's how security systems work.
Yes.
And we had Feinstein allude to that when she talked about how on the release of the CIA torture report, that these people play hardball. These people, remember that comment? They play dirty. Well, what that said is that they have everything on me, they have everything on my staff, and when you have, and we saw it in a kind of cruder form with Hoover, when they have everything on you, they control you.
Yes.
And they have everything on us.
And in the case of Feinstein, who did not tell us what the government was doing as far as information, who lied to us actually, as did Barack Obama, saying, oh, it's only metadata
Right.
and so forth. Well, that turned out to be utter nonsense.
Right.
They have everything on you. You know, the content of your emails and your phone conversations and everything else. But where she panicked was when they went after her staff.
Yeah.
And she thought, I'm a big shot senator.
Right. So they think they're immune.
Yeah.
But as soon as they buck the system, they're treated like everyone else.
And they were going to frame the staff. And it's really quite ominous. I mean, you'd have to
But Bob, that is an example of if these people buck the system, why are they not going to be treated like that?
Oh, I think they will. I'm not saying that they are going to win. They're not going to win on their own, and then they're not going to fight that hard, by the way. Right. Some of this is PR. Some of this is to convince us.
Well, and as you pointed out, you have figures like Bezos who have a financial interest in perpetuating the system.
Exactly. And so, but the fact of the matter is, if they don't push back, if we don't have rules of the road, you undermine what is meant by a multinational corporation. So from a profitability, okay, if you really want to, you know, right now Google has 90% of the European search market.
Right.
And by having that, they have 90% of the data on who are Europeans.
And aren't the Germans reacting to that? They're
Yes.
building their own search
And they're
market.
pushing back. And the European Court, which is not, you can't appeal it, has said, no, Google can't define you, you have a right to change that record. That was a very important decision. So they're getting pushback. And, you know, companies come and go. You know, big, proud, profitable companies suddenly, you know, we see that all the time. I mean, what happened to AOL, you know? I mean, they, you know, just because you're big now doesn't mean you're going to be big even 3 years from now. Microsoft is not the powerful company it was. So they're very conscious. Things can go south on them, you know? And so all I'm saying is, and let's take it off them a bit, why aren't more liberal politicians concerned? I mean, here you have this atrocity of Hillary Clinton condemning Edward Snowden as a traitor. Hillary Clinton, who was up to her eyeballs in all this as Secretary of State, knew damn well what this government was doing. Hillary Clinton, who said, you know, I can't trust the State Department with my emails. I'm going to have them stored in my garage, right? She's in charge of the State Department, can't trust the State Department with our emails, but tells us that when Edward Snowden tells us our emails are being read, he is weakening our country. He's giving aid and comfort to the enemy. She didn't tell us. It remained for Edward Snowden to tell us, right? So she's saying we, you know, should trust the State Department, the CIA, the NSA to go through our emails, right, when she won't, even though she was in charge. So that kind of hypocrisy coming from, you know, people we would have counted on. Now I'm going to exclude the good liberals who may be in the ACLU. We have principled civil libertarians, and on the left and the right, we have principled libertarians. Much of the good pushback informing us comes from the Electronic Frontier Foundation and other groups that basically are of a libertarian bent. So we're getting as much pushback against government surveillance from principled Republicans as we are from principled Democrats. That's really sad. To my mind, as somebody who has been more on the liberal side of things. But the abandonment, say, by this constitutional law professor, Barack Obama, he knows this stuff better than I do. First of all, he knows the extent of surveillance because he's ordering it up. But as a constitutional law professor, he knows why we have a Fourth Amendment. He knows why we have to have individual sovereignty. He knows why we have to observe the government. Why is he not using his presidency as a bully pulpit to educate us about our Constitution? And, you know, this is a great gift America has made to the world. I was accused in the Los Angeles Times book review of my book of being, you know, overpraising the framers and, you know, being, you know, too much on the rhetoric of freedom. The fact is this country made a great contribution to human history in the notion of limited government. that to have a printed document, a living printed document, that guards against government overreach. That is a very basic notion. It's a notion that the people on the left who were naive about leftist governments or governments claiming to be leftist in the world. I interviewed Fidel Castro the night the Soviets went into Czechoslovakia. I had been waiting for this interview weeks. Unfortunately, he wouldn't let me use my tape recorder. And in that interview, we at that moment, he was against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. He changed the position a few days later, but we had a lively debate about how did you, a Catholic radical who was not supported by the communists in Czechoslovakia until 6 months before you were able to get rid of Batista, are you naive about what communism came to mean? And don't you understand? Why don't you have a First Amendment? There I am sitting with Fidel Castro at 2 a.m. with guys with guns challenging him about what I learned in City College and Government 1A, reading the basic issues of American democracy. The great contribution of our framers was the notion of limited government.
Bob, our Constitution has been absolutely rewritten by judicial fiat. None of, whether it's privacy, whether it's First Amendment rights, whether it is the decision by the Supreme Court to interpret unlimited campaign contributions by corporations as the petitioning the government, whether it is drawing up kill lists, whether it is the misuse of the Espionage Act to shut down whistleblowers, whether it is the misinterpretation of the Authorization to Use Military Force Act to assassinate, serve as judge, jury. I mean, it's gone. It doesn't. And the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, where I sued Obama in federal court, won the first round. In the second round, they won't confront the issue because it's patently unconstitutional. They deny my standing.
Okay, but it's not gone in my mind, and it's not.
But it's not real anymore. It doesn't exist in an actual legal fact.
Well, okay.
I mean, do we have habeas corpus?
Again, let me be the naive optimist here. There was a decision by the Roberts Supreme Court, I discussed it at length in the book, last June. And as an educational point, and with the force of law, that unanimous decision of our Supreme Court, the so-called liberals and the conservatives all signed on, but the language of Chief Justice Roberts was very clear on the most important point. Do we have a living Constitution? By that I mean, does technology trump the aspirations of the framers, and particularly as relates to the Fourth Amendment? The argument, and it had been made by the tech industry, was made by Facebook, it was made by Google, Eric Schmidt, other people there who said, oh, get over privacy, forget it, the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply, the cat's out of the bag, technology has trumped all that. You hear that from young people, you can't do. The Roberts Court said something quite the opposite. They said, in its decision, said there's more information on this smartphone than there ever was in anyone's home. And the reason the Fourth Amendment is in there, he said, the spark that started the American Revolution was the idea that is in the Fourth Amendment, that in English common law, the King of England could not enter the home of the humblest peasant, okay, the hovel, could not enter it and rummage around in his personal effects with a general writ because that violated his rights, his sovereignty, the King of England. And when they started doing it in the colonies, and when Otis was on trial and Adams was recording it, he said, that's the spark that started the American Revolution, because you're rummaging about with these general writs, which is what the NSA is the other. Okay, when the police arrested that fellow in the decision that the court held on, and he had a cell phone, and they cracked the code and got this information, the court said you cannot use that information. The court then said, and we should, rally around it, and then we should say, okay, why don't you apply that to the NSA? Why don't you apply it to the CIA? Because the principle is quite clear, that this technology does not trump the Fourth Amendment, it makes it more vital, a more robust definition. And your personal sovereignty goes from your home with you. You have to have your the integrity of your freedom established. So as opposed to the position, and I'm a great admirer of your work, but I think if we accept that they've won this and they've won that and they won that, Then we excuse people. This does not apply to you, obviously, because you are a fighter and you're out there. It gives people a cop-out. It says it's over. You know, I find this everywhere I speak. You know, I say, you know, there'll be people in the audience say, oh, unless we get Citizens United overturned, unless we get money out of politics, unless we do it's all over. Well, I won't accept that. If people can fight back in Stalin's Russia, fight back against the Stasi, who are dissidents. If people fought back against Hitler, there were plenty of people that try to fight back, okay? And at least they alerted people outside of their countries, you know? There are people sitting in jail in Egypt now who try to fight back.
Let me just...
So I think you have to seize the room that we have. And the room that we have, okay, I'll be very clear about this. The room that we have is we have this document called the U.S. Constitution and a history around it that cannot be just dismissed by anyone who has any respect for logic, fact, or history. I'm sorry. There is a Fourth Amendment, okay? And as even the Roberts Court said, that Fourth Amendment is more relevant now than ever. And you cannot read the words of the Fourth Amendment and say what the NSA is doing is constitutional.
Right.
That's what drove Bill Binney into becoming a dissident, right? After 40 years of working in our national security state, he said, what you're doing is outrageous, it's destroying our society. It's what drove Daniel Ellsberg, who had been a Marine, who was in the defense establishment. He writes and works on the Pentagon Papers. He says, what you are doing is destroying our democracy. You're destroying our Constitution. There's a power in that idea and in that tradition.
All right, let me respond to that, because, I mean, that is true if we had a functioning judiciary. 94% of people never go to trial. And this gets into the whole system of mass incarceration. If actually everybody went to trial, which was their right, the system would collapse. It's not built to care, so that we don't have a functioning judiciary. I mean, this presupposes a system that isn't there. And in terms of resistance, the reason that, I think that it's important to grapple with the darkness that has gripped the country is that if we believe it's reformable, if we keep doing the kind of Van Jones turn where we pump our energy back into a system that will never respond, then we're responding not only to a non-reality based belief system, but all of our resistance is futile. If we understand that the system has to be removed, that we have to build mass movements that call for the absolute destruction of corporate power, and stop investing ourselves in a judicial system or a system of electoral politics that is at this point never going to respond, then we have hope. But I think we have to understand how bleak it is, and we have to face that reality, and then step out and find appropriate mechanisms to respond.
Okay, now we have a good relationship. I'm actually your editor at Truth Thing. You're going to have to give me 20 more minutes, because this is really our fundamental. And I want, let's just tell people who are watching this, this is our tension in our ideas. And I think it's an important one that people should address, not because we disagree, but because it's something we have to think about. How do you get change?
Right.
And I've spent my whole life, as you have, grappling with this question. And, we went through this with the New Left in the 60s, and you had, groups as extreme or whatever as the Weathermen and the Black Panthers and so forth, saying, the system is broken. And then there were other people, one of whom's one of your heroes, Ralph Nader, Martin Luther King, others who said, no, if we accept that view, that there's no room to organize, there's no way of saving the system, there's no way of holding it accountable, and instead, no, they said, here, certainly Martin Luther King understood the distortions of the system as far as segregation, how rigged the game was, how unfair the judicial system was, how contradictory the interpretation of the Constitution had been. The Constitution even denied the humanity of black people by not being fully human. I mean, it was a denial of really what the New Testament says about all each having a soul. Because if blacks in the South had a soul, right, they couldn't be, treated in that way, right? So, this is a fundamental question. What does this tradition mean? And yes, I do seem naive and rose-colored glasses about our Constitution. The reason I invoke it is it's like invoking, you were telling me, reading Solzhenitsyn or reading Hannah Arendt. The reason I invoke it is that these people return us to ideas that we need to be reminded of because they keep us human.
All right, well, we're going to get into that, and I'm going to slam the Founding Fathers. I think we've given them too much of a pass here. I'm Chris Hedges for The Real News. This is part 4 of my interview with Robert Scheer, the author of They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. We are going to come back for part 5. Thank you very much, Bob. Welcome back. I'm Chris Hedges. This is The Real News. This is part 5 of my conversation with Robert Scheer, the author of They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. I love the book. It's brilliant. You're a great writer, and it's an important book. I wouldn't say they are destroying democracy. I would say they have destroyed democracy. You have held up, throughout this conversation, the Founding Fathers. And I want to go back to Thomas Paine, who was the real radical, who called for, he didn't use the word socialism, but a type of socialism, who was an abolitionist, who was a proponent of direct democracy, which the Founding Fathers were not, who opposed the genocidal campaigns against Native Americans, which all of the Founding Fathers embraced with relish, who wanted rights for women. And I think Zinn points out that all of these freedoms that you talk about were reserved for a very small, select group of largely slave-holding white males, our aristocratic class, who replaced the aristocratic class of Britain. And that it was, Washington, by the time he was president, was the wealthiest person in the United States, largely by seizing Indian lands with land speculators and selling it for a profit. Of course, he himself was a large slaveholder. And that through the constitutional conventions that were held after independence, you really saw a rolling back of that populism and radicalism that Paine, who himself became a pariah, spoke so eloquently about, and of course common sense and his journalism were used to fuel, because most of the people fighting the revolution were yeoman farmers. So they created mechanisms by which we would never have a voice. The Senate, the Electoral College, that's how you had Al Gore win 500,000 more votes than Bush, and Bush still wins. Nader did not lose the election. Everything was built into the system to create a kind of protection of rights for a very select few. And we saw throughout American history, and Zinn does this in his book, the struggle by labor, by women, by African Americans, the Communist Party. We have erased the importance of the Communist Party in this country all through the 20s and 30s. These radical movements that opened up that space in American democracy. All of those movements have been shut down in the name of anti-communism, starting with Wilson, but running right through past McCarthy. Labor is a spent force. You talk about labor. We have less than 12% of the American workforce is unionized. Only 6% of the labor force in the private sector is unionized. We have created an oligarchic state, a form of neo-feudalism. You have half this country living in poverty or near poverty. We have a looming climate crisis, especially since we are not, and Barack Obama drills like Sarah Palin, we are not able to stop the ravaging of the planet, whether it's the tar sands or dropping drill bits up into the summer Arctic sea ice by Shell Oil, profiting off the death throes of the planet. These people are barreling forward in terms of the impoverishment of the working class, the destruction of the environment, and they have created mechanisms. They certainly are prepared for unrest. They have run scenario after scenario after scenario, and they have created mechanisms, militarized police, drones, security and surveillance, and evisceration. Obama's assault on civil liberties is worse than, as I said before, anything Bush has done. They're ready to go. They know something's coming, and they're totally prepared. And I don't see in that mechanism that they have put into place, and what they have done in terms of creating both a legal, a judicial, and a security system that is so powerful, so pervasive, and as you said, far beyond anything the Stasi ever dreamt of. I don't see how, at that point, appealing or believing that the system is reformable is anything but futile.
I have no truly coherent, rational way of countering what you just said. All I have is biography. And here I do feel as a journalist, what have I seen, just as what have you seen? And, this period is not, to me, darker than, say, the period I grew up in. I mean, if we can get a little personal here, I was born in 1936. My father lost his job. My father was a German Protestant from, heavy accent. And my mother, who was Jewish, did not have papers because my mother, who was a refugee from communism, amazingly enough, her movement, the Jewish Socialist Bund, had been crushed by Lenin. And like many of the immigrants who came to this country, she had a checkered political past and lawyers. And then she got involved in labor strikes. The first month she was here, was arrested some 10 times in the first half year, and lawyers told her, don't apply for citizenship because they'll deport you. And so I was and they weren't even married legally, and they even misspelled my name on my birth certificate at Bronx Hospital. So I guess I came into this world and this country with uncertainty all around. And, what do you do? What is you relate? And my parents were very poor and living in the Bronx, and my father had another family he had to support, et cetera, et cetera. So I, looked around, but yet there was a tradition and an excitement about social issues, in part because a guy who could be seen as a ruling class reformer, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, however, gave hope. Okay, and now I can reread Roosevelt, and I can go back and study Roosevelt. I could talk about Roosevelt's failing, turning back people trying to enter this country who are escaping fascism. I could talk about the failure to enter the war against fascism and I give the same lecture you gave, just opening this thing. Why did it take so long to open the second front in the war? And why did we treat the Germans, Americans living in this country different than the Japanese Americans? Why all of my German relatives, none of them were rounded up, and the Japanese were. My half-brother bombed our hometown in Germany. He was in the Air Force. No one challenged his pay. So and then, I remember as a kid, I had a guy named Carl Jurgens was one of my closest friends. He couldn't play baseball, but he was the best baseball player. I remember being taken by one of my Uncle Edward, to picket Ebbets Field, so they would hire Negroes, I remember McCarthyism coming in, and I was delivering milk then when I was 12 and a half years old, and people were throwing out books in the garbage cans and trying to get rid of them. Well, one of the sets they threw out was a collected works of Jefferson. Because in that crazy McCarthy period, not only Tom Paine, who after all, his body was dug up at another period and his bones scattered to the landscape. And by the way, just let me reinforce what you said. I don't think we would have had a Bill of Rights were it not for Tom Paine and other people like that. We wouldn't have had a limited government and the checks and balances and separation of powers built into the Constitution the way they were. Were there not a great deal of suspicion of the elite, the guys with the wigs, and everything else who were making this law? So to get a nation built, to get a constitution, and Charles and Mary Beard and other scholars of that whole period have brilliantly outlined, this was forced upon them. The reason the Fourth Amendment is there, it was forced upon these people in government. However you get this thing, and this goes for societies that claim to be built on socialism, after all, this what dissonance in any society Christian dissidents, Muslim dissidents who say, no, you're betraying the Quran. They look for the parts of the tradition that give them clarity and moral support. In my own teaching on ethics, I rely heavily, and you have much better training than I do, but I rely on the Good Samaritan. I think that is a testament to why we have to care about poor people. I now rely on the Pope's writings about poverty and so forth. So we find our inspiration wherever we can. And I certainly would not give a blank check to the founders, but I would say there is something in that tradition that is invaluable. And the notion of distrust of government, distrust of the powerful.
And division of power. That's key.
Yeah. But the idea that it has to be checked, and the belief that ordinary people are capable of understanding their circumstance. And I agree with you. The definition of ordinary people was limited. But, after all, Tom Paine, who was a recent immigrant and who was a corset maker and a worker and so forth, he was in that ordinary definition. People did listen to him. They read his pamphlets. We had a penny press. We had wall posters. We had dissent from the very beginning. And that dissent demanded to be heard. And the only way they could weave this nation together was not just by going to the elite, because the elite was fragmented. After all, much of the elite in this country supported the Brits. They supported the king. Washington was an exception in that respect, and Madison and Hamilton. There was a very significant group of people that didn't want to challenge the king, or who were indifferent. Another third, and maybe a third, were really the revolutionaries.
Well, the reason Paine rose is because the entire government in Philadelphia remained loyal to the crown.
Exactly.
And so they had to work with it. Paine made them very uncomfortable.
Yes,
but they
exactly.
had no choice.
And Paine was not alone. There was Sam Adams. There were others. So we understand that. What I don't want to lose here is, however this Constitution got written, and however it's been interpreted, it has within it, particularly the issue we're here to discuss today, this Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment and the protection against self-incrimination and all of those other things, those ideas, just like some ideas you will find in Marx's writings, or you'll find in Confucius or Aristotle's writings, for all of the contradiction, right? All the contradictions, when you find those ideas, you want to hold on to them, and you want to raise them, you want to address them, And that idea of limited government, that idea that we have these basic rights that no one can take away, I found as a kid to be the source of my own energy. Otherwise, I would have given up, I can tell you, just let me give you one little personal thing. I worked in the post office to go through college, okay? Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, his father worked in the post, okay? He came out of that experience and said, I'm going to be as rich as anybody can be because I don't want to end up in the post office, all right? I had the opposite experience. I felt the people working with me in the post office, many who were vets from World War II, Korean War, so I felt, these people are as smart as anyone I ever meet in the university or anywhere else. They're being deceived. They're being lied to. They're not being given the information. If we can give them the information, if we can raise these issues, if we can invoke the best parts of our tradition, then we got a shot, okay? And we can reverse some of these laws. We had Taft-Hartley come in that destroyed the unions.
1948.
We had McCarthyism come in, and we had to fight back, And you're absolutely right. It was, this is what Martin Luther King referred to. Why did the FBI go after Martin Luther King? What was Hoover's excuse? Hoover's excuse is that he had two close associates who were former communists. Huh? No, not just Bayard Rustin. He had, I'm blocking on their names, but there was one black and one white Jewish.
Oh, the lawyer, Leventhal.
And then I'm forgetting the other person.
Lowenstein.
Yeah, and Hoover went after King because King wouldn't kick those people out, and he wouldn't kick out Bayard Rustin also. And he used red baiting against Hoover.
Right, but I would argue that, at that point, however flawed the system was, and we both understand it was deeply flawed, the Constitution was a living document. At this point, Stalin had one of the most enlightened constitutions ever written. And so all of these things remain true on paper, but they're not a judicial reality. We now live in a country where the military and this is another direct violation of the Constitution, can come in and carry out extraordinary rendition on the streets of American cities against American citizens deemed to be terrorists by the government, held in military facilities, and stripped of due process. I mean, that's just one of many examples. So over and over and over, we have seen, largely through the courts, a reinterpretation, a radical reinterpretation of our most basic constitutional rights to essentially nullify those rights.
Okay, let's understand something. I'm saying this not because I want to flatter you. First of all, I know it's not possible. You don't fall for that. But seriously, I am your editor at Truthdig. And I have said publicly, and I'll say it now, I think you're the most important journalist we have in the world. Okay, that I know of. I'm sure there are others that are more important. I just don't know them. Okay, I don't read their language. Or I don't follow them. The reason I say that is because you are, let's say it, the scold, the uncompromising person who has called the university to task. You did it when you gave that speech at a commencement. You called the New York Times to task when you wouldn't accept their terms for going along. And you haven't even pointed out the biggest problem we have in the society, which is not the Cheneys. It's not the really proto-fascists that we have out there. It's the good Germans. Yeah. It's the people who have gone along. It's the New York Times when they allowed Wen-Ho Lee, not only allowed, encouraged Wen-Ho Lee, a scientist at Los Alamos, to be held in solitary confinement and humiliated with lights on him 24/7 on totally trumped up charges. It's when we're treating our whistleblowers, when this president has gone after whistleblowers with an intensity that exceeds that of all previous presidents.
Or Chelsea Manning exposes clear war crimes, and the only person who's prosecuted is not those helicopter pilots who violated, I think, 3 or 4.
Okay, so I think you've talked about making a real contribution. Your unique contribution is to call out the enablers of a move towards fascism. And without them, there cannot be.
That's right.
There cannot be. What happened in Germany was that the good Germans went along. That we know that. That's really what Hannah Arendt put. That's what is meant by the banality of evil, okay? That people went along because their careerism trumped their integrity, because of their fear trumped it, and that, of course, is what the surveillance state is expecting and has expected. And the betrayal of a Nancy Pelosi, as Bill Benny pointed out, the reason Nancy Pelosi could not go for impeaching George W. Bush is he called in the 2 top leaders of the House and the Senate and had them made them complicit. He did what the mafia did. And there's a famous quote from the head of Citicorp when Bill Clinton gave them the reversal of Glass-Steagall. He said he called up the president and told him what really was going on. He said to turn to his partner, said, "We made the president complicit in this deal." So there's no question that you have caught the real illness of our society, which is the complicity of well-intentioned, well-spoken, well-educated people going along with absolute madness. The people at the New York Times or elsewhere who told us, oh, we buy this weapons of mass destruction and we're going to go invade Iraq, a government that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, they went along. And then when you don't find the weapons, they still go along with the war. And they still go along with the lies. And then, yes, let's talk about Chelsea Manning. Here is a person who, what was the great crime? To show us that civilians were killed in Iraq, including shooting at Reuters reporters, and that the government was not going to tell us, and instead of that person being awarded with a Nobel Prize, sitting in jail for this very length of term. Yes, but where we disagree is that I feel inspired by the what's the right word? I want to say non-sellout, but that's too meek. By the wonderful moments of our history, by the saving grace of a Daniel Ellsberg or Chelsea Manning or so forth. And what are they doing? They're doing the same thing that the dissidents did in the Soviet Union. The dissidents of the Soviet Union were really appealing originally to the promise of socialism that was betrayed. After all, the promise of socialism was not to implement a system more coercive than what the Tsar had, right? Okay, so that's what a dissident does in Cuba. You know, it's to appeal to what was supposed to be the promise of the Cuban Revolution. The first people that Fidel Castro cracked down on were people who had written for Lunes de Revolución, which was the cultural segment of the revolution's paper. Exactly. And these people said, you are betraying the Cuban Revolution. What I say in this book is you're betraying the basic, positive, most thrilling notion of the American experience, which is the notion that we individuals are the ones that are guarding freedom, not you guys who are in power. We are obligated as citizens to challenge you at every turn, you who have all the power. That is the requirement of our Constitution, whether the Supreme Court acknowledges it or not. So I want to call them out, and I think, and that's why I brought up the biographical things, I think that gives us room to call them out, okay? Because they have tried to take away our legitimacy. They take away the legitimacy of a Chelsea Manning, right? They say, you are a traitor, right? I am saying, no, Chelsea Manning is a heroine, okay? Heroine. You know, Bill Biney is a hero. You know, Edward Snowden is a great hero. Daniel Ellsberg was a hero, in the same way that Tom Paine was a hero.
And we'll end on that. Thank you very much, Bob Scheer. We've been discussing Bob's extremely important book, They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. It's been a pleasure. As you know, I hold very few people in this country, and certainly very few journalists, in as high a regard as I hold you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News. Welcome back. I'm Chris Hedges for The Real News, and I'm speaking with Robert Scheer about his new book, They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. We have in previous discussions had some dispute about whether we are destroying it or whether it's destroyed. And we're going to try and talk in this last section a little bit about the culture of violence in the United States, which makes it very different from many other countries. Canada would be a good example. And how in a moment of societal breakdown, that violence will manifest itself. So let me begin. We are a deeply violent culture. We always have been. It is the nature of imperialism, which of course we colonized ourselves in a way that's very different from Europe, with the subjugation and campaigns of genocide against Native Americans. The whole institution of slavery was one that was kept in force by coercion, and then the subjugation of African Americans after emancipation through convict leasing, up to Jim Crow laws, up to the current system of mass incarceration, which of course targets, as Michelle Alexander has pointed out, primarily people of color, poor people of color. We have one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the industrialized world, 83 weapons, I think, per 100 Americans. I believe I have that figure right. Not only are there young African-American men that are killed week after week after week, even after this, these killings are caught on videotape, and in most cases, the police are not charged. I mean, since Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, we'd had 11 people shot dead in the St. Louis area. And that's just writ large. We have these bizarre school shootings, largely carried out by people who come out of the white survivalist cult. It's not violence by African Americans. Adam Lanza's mother was a survivalist. And then we have proto-fascist entities, the Christian right, Tea Party, militias, the Minutemen and others who celebrate not only the gun culture, but celebrate or I think express those fundamental tenets of fascism, which is where you direct your rage and legitimate despair towards the vulnerable, towards undocumented workers, Muslims, homosexuals, liberals, intellectuals, feminists. And in a moment of breakdown, and I think we are headed for some type of breakdown, all of these groups are empowered to express themselves in our society through violence. And I think that, especially having come out of disintegrating societies, I covered the war in Yugoslavia, or I covered the civil war in El Salvador, I'm cognizant of how swiftly societies can unravel, how quickly law and order breaks down, how fragile social, political, and cultural systems are, and how easily neighbor can kill neighbor, how swiftly human beings can be acculturated to carry out atrocities. That's one of the most disturbing things that comes out of being a war correspondent. And I think in this last segment, I'd like to have you look at a little bit that reality, the reality of American violence, our propensity for violence, and how, as things unravel, that may express itself within American society.
Well, there's no question about our propensity for violence. I was in Vietnam, both the South and the North, and I saw what carpet bombing does, and I saw the destruction. I mean, 3.5 million people were killed, Indo-Chinese people, along with 59,000 Americans, and there was no rhyme or reason, and the bloodlust, the vengeance, the indifference to human life, the idea that maybe these people had families and cared, loved, the people were bombing and napalming and so forth. That's pretty blatant. I still have not gotten over the bombing of Japan and Germany, even though we're on the right side. The dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And I think in a very important column you wrote, you correctly pointed out that it was dropped on a non-military zone to send a message to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's the greatest act of terrorism that the world has ever seen, is the dropping of the bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The target was during the day when school children would be out, would be vulnerable. There was no military reason for it. General Eisenhower was against it and said there was no reason. And it was done to justify a big wartime program that we had spent money on, but it was also to prevent Soviets from being one of the occupying powers of Japan and so forth. So there was a lot of cynical political reasons. So I have no doubt that Martin Luther King was right when he condemned the U.S. government as the major purveyor of violence in the world. Today, we have that capacity and we have the technology. Where I disagree is to blame this on anything that traces back to who we are as a people. I think we are manipulated into violence. I don't think it's part of our culture. I think the basic cultural experience coming out of an immigrant culture, which we are, all of us are immigrants, with the exception of the people we committed genocide against, the native population, came here to do things other than to be violent. They wanted to succeed, they wanted to have security, they wanted to have family. And I remember growing up in the Bronx, which was like growing up in the Balkans or something. I mean, one part of my building were Orthodox Russians, and another part were Jews, and I had German relatives and Jewish, and you had the Italians over there, and the Irish, and the Puerto Ricans, and so forth. I felt that our tensions really were a response to the weaknesses of the society. I remember my aunt was a German maid, and she was very proud that she was a German maid. And she had a false sense of class consciousness because she wanted to say she was superior to the Irish maids, who felt they had to be superior to the Puerto Rican maids. And, there's always this dividing and, trying to salvage some respectability and some power from your class, your religion, your culture, and so forth. But I felt that the violence that I saw, and it goes back to an early age because I was born into the Second World War, was really the responsibility of our leaders. I felt this very strongly. I didn't have to talk myself into it. I remember even as a kid trying to figure out what's going on. Why is the German part of my family exterminating the Jewish part of my family? After all, my mother had come from Lithuania, and my father come from Germany. I struggled with it as a kid. And so as I spent a lot of time, I've been back to Germany many times. I found my father's brother who was wounded at Stalingrad. I've seen this. I tried to find my Jewish relatives in Lithuania or something. And when I look back at what was going on, the part of our country that said, oh, Hitler's not so bad because he'll knock off Stalin. The group that said, oh, let them fight it out, or we don't have to intervene, or the contradictions in it all. It seemed to me it was the use of politics by people who had imperial ambitions, who played with politics, who used it as excuse for getting their own power or profit or what have you, that caused the misery for others. And this had to do with domestic issues as well, divide and conquer. What after all was the civil rights movement about was to say, those who supported the civil rights movement. I remember going, the first trip to the South was 1960, and I actually visited an integrated Christian community, a Koinonia farm, where they had been bombed and attacked and so forth. And it was clear to me that powerful interests in this country benefited from segregation. Say the Democratic Party. Why did the Democratic Party put up with a segregated South? Because it delivered Democratic votes. Everybody forgets that now. We had this benign view of Lyndon Johnson. Oh no, the Selma movie didn't give Johnson enough credit. That was utter nonsense. Lyndon Johnson was a Southern politician. He didn't act aggressively enough when he was coming up. He certainly could have stopped Hoover from destroying Martin Luther King. There was a great deal of indifference, and were it not for a heroic grassroots civil rights movement, there wouldn't have been any progress. This was true of the labor movement. I mean, my parents were very active in the labor movement. They were on picket lines and all this sort of thing. So my view of the society is that the impulses that came up from below, and I don't think I'm romanticizing it, were closer to Woody Guthrie's description or Pete Seeger's description of, that people had a thirst for freedom, and it ultimately would be in favor of equality and respect for individual. And if I could just add one little thought, what I've been doing as a journalist all my life is trying to get powerful, respectable, ruling class, well-educated people to do the right thing. It's why are you in a war that makes no sense? Why are you ignoring poverty? Why aren't you more concerned about income inequality? Why do you smash the labor movement? So most of my issues in my life and my reporting and my concern is, why are you people being so irrational and selfish and mean-spirited? You people of power. So that, I know.
Well, because for them it does make sense. I mean, Raytheon and, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, their stock prices have quadrupled. They would love to drop cruise missiles all over Syria and Iran because that's how they make money.
And they make money in the short term.
Yeah, but they only think in the short term.
You see, I had the misfortune or fortune, I can't tell you, to actually travel around with Nelson Rockefeller, with Richard Nixon. I mean, to interview these people, to, be there at the presence. And I think they had enough wisdom to know that this would lead to the destruction of the nation, including the foreign policy. I mean, after all, there was the alliance of Americas. There was, all of these attempts that they gave lip service, but I think it was more than lip service, that we had an elite that intellectually could comprehend that this stuff was self-defeating. Let's take the rise of terrorism. It's a very good example. Who are the people who pushed for going into Afghanistan and supporting these so-called freedom fighters? It started with a guy named Zbigniew Brzezinski. who was working for Carter. And Brzezinski has been quoted in Nouvelle Observateur. They did an interview with him. And they said, look, wasn't it crazy? There was a secular government in Kabul. It happened to be close to the Russians, but you went and got these so-called freedom fighters, and you couldn't find enough religious fanatics in Afghanistan. You had to find them where? In Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, you know, and bring them there, and the CIA recruited them. What were you thinking? That question, what were you thinking, comes up all the time. What were you thinking when you went into Vietnam, a small, you know, very poor country that was never going to be able to attack you? How did you ignore the Sino-Soviet dispute? How did you ignore Vietnam's 1,000 years of having been occupied by China? Where did you get this invention of an international communist movement? What were you thinking? And your answer is they were thinking short-run profit and short-run political ambition, right?
I'm talking about the arms industry.
Yeah, but generally, what were you thinking?
Well, a lot of them don't think. I mean, a lot of them are not culturally, historically, or linguistically literate about the countries they seek to dominate.
Now, here I am in total agreement. The great lesson in my life is we don't have adults watching the store.
Well, that's...
I was raised with the idea they must be adults. They, after all, have gone to the best colleges. They sound good. They seem to be informed. They have great advisors. And I've spent my life, a good part of my life, analyzing these people, being around them, traveling with them, attending their conferences, interviewing them. And what I have found is this stupidity, this lack of intellectual curiosity.
Well, they're also blinded by, you know, their own power, their economic and their military power, and they believe that they can reshape the world in their image because they have that power.
Yes, but why did they, taking this back to the beginning of this whole discussion of the 6 parts, my reading of the framers is there was a wisdom to that elite group of powdered, wigged characters, that they had studied the collapse of other societies. They understood that Rome had become a disaster. They understood that the English limited monarchy was a disaster. They understood that, you know, that the French Revolution was a necessity. And they were determined to avoid that path. I mean, this is, maybe we have a disagreement, but my book is based on the idea that our Constitution is an attempt to avoid Rome.
Well, that's true, and they were classicists, and they read Cicero. But at the same time, they were implanting the very seeds of violence through slavery, through the subjugation of indigenous communities, which began with the Puritans, you know, eradicating the Narragansetts and everybody else, the Iroquois. And so there was this contradiction in terms of their particular ideal and their actual activity, and that the violence of American culture is deeply seated and deeply rooted since our inception and has never left. And I think when you talk about you know, groups of people who want liberty, we go back to Marx and his understanding of the lumpen proletariat, that these were the people that signed up faster than anyone else to join the brown shirts, or whatever, you know, fascist equivalent there is. And Eric Fromm writes about this in Escape from Freedom, that there is a segment of society that has the kind of individual strength to accept the anxiety that comes with freedom. But especially in moments of turmoil, you have large segments of a society, and I would argue a majority of a society, that wants the iron fist. And they don't want to make moral choice. They want to be told what to do.
And this is where we disagree, because my view of what happened, say the period I was growing up, is that because of the Great Depression, we had a mass movement in this country that was determined to change the economy, make it more responsive to the needs of people, empower workers, empower farmers, who were then generally small farmers, protect them against the vicissitudes of what was called the free market, to break the cartels, whether it's Teddy Roosevelt, whether it's Walter Reuther, or whether it's more radical people. That there was a general consensus, mass consensus, okay, that this stuff was not working. And there was also, sometimes it was called isolationism, but there was a strong feeling of resistance going back to the founders of not getting involved in empire. Empire is a loser, empire is distracting, and so forth. And what happened was that an elite distorted those movements. That certainly after the Second World War, we could have gone the route of Henry Wallace, which was really a continuation.
Well, they destroyed Henry Wallace.
Okay, but that was a continuation of Roosevelt,
right,
who I think became a true believer in progress. You know, imperfect, but a true believer that we have to go that way. And the movement that had come out, that was broad labor movement, the auto workers, the electrical workers, the chemical, the steel workers were in these massive, industrial unions that were inherently progressive and were increasingly opening up to minorities, increasingly because
very late, but
but the war had changed the labor force, including minorities, women. This is where the South, people from the South came up north and so forth. And at a critical moment in American history, that movement for progress was betrayed by this primitive anti-communism, by which I mean a scapegoating of what was...
Right, but that began after World War I, with the destruction of the Wobblies, the CIO, everyone, number one. But number two, I think that within, we had the bloodiest labor wars of any industrialized country. Hundreds of American workers were murdered, thousands were wounded and injured, tens of thousands were blacklisted, and we have seen throughout American society armed vigilante groups tacitly and often directly supported by the state, whether that's Baldwin Felts, whether that's the Klan, whether that's the White Leagues.
But you do realize, Chris, what's dividing us here now is, if I understand this correctly, I think it's a serious division. My reading of American history, yes, we always can have lumpen proletariat. We will have drunken people doing this. We'll have, but my view of American history, and I think it's an accurate one, I don't think it's a romanticization, was that the aspirations of the people in this country, from all of their immigrant background, was basically a healthy aspiration of a better life, a fairer life, more opportunity. And that at critical points it has been betrayed by an elite that even betrayed its own long-run interests.
Right, but Bob, look at westward expansion. It was a better life at the expense of indigenous Native Americans.
No question about it.
But that's not a small thing.
I'm not saying it's a small thing.
And when they got in our way, we killed them.
Okay.
And if you look at...
But we have to look at what the we is, okay? Where we are disagreeing is the degree of responsibility and authority and power of ordinary people. It's like when I celebrate, I stopped going to Seder's because I would always have an argument. Why are you drowning the firstborn of the Egyptians? They don't have any power. They didn't elect the pharaoh. They didn't have information. They didn't know what's going on. Well, that's the way I feel about the American public, okay? That they have been lied to by an elite all through my life. And then when in the face of true crisis like the Depression and the war, the elite was forced to reform. That's what Roosevelt was. And that we reached a moment of relative sanity, opportunity, fairness, and so forth, okay? It doesn't whitewash everything that came before. But the only reason we had a civil rights movement is that because of the crisis of the war, the Depression, and everything, and the movement of black people from the South, and the need to deal with democracy in the world, right? We had to end segregation in the military. We had to be consistent. That's why, you had the movement in that direction. And what I'm saying is the difference, and I see it now more clearly than I have previously, is I put the onus on the people who were in the elite, who had power, who could shape the debate, whether it was Hearst or whether it was Oakes. I blame the elite. My people at City College did not mess up this country, okay? Some of them rose to positions of power. Some of them got ahead. But in the main, we were struggling to make sense of a society in which we had very little power, okay? And to the degree that we could have an impact on it, we made it a better society. At every key turn, it was an elite, and some increasingly came from poorer backgrounds and were co-opted, but it was an elite that didn't even have the sense to act in an adult, rational way for their own self-interest. Going along, basically, with the war in Vietnam, for instance, that's the whole point of the best and the brightest. They introduced madness in foreign policy, right? All the stuff that, blaming the CIA for, that the CIA was an elite organization. It was the establishment. It was the product of our best education. Who are the people? McNamara is
no, I don't disagree with any of that, but I would say that at the same time, because we benefited from, especially economically, from the fruits of empire, we are complicit. And if you look at any cavalry unit in westward expansion, 60, 70% of them, including the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn, they didn't even speak English. They could hardly get on a horse because as soon as they got off a boat from Ireland, there were no jobs. They were recruited to go. We even had black soldiers.
Right, but you're suggesting that they could empower themselves to comprehend and challenge. Some did, but in the main, they are the victims. They are the victims because they were fleeing starvation in Ireland. Right. They're trying to survive. They're in this place, and people, an elite, says this is the way to behave. Well, and let's go to our job as journalists. All my life, the people that I was growing up with and I was around were being lied to, systematically lied to. I remember in school, PS 89, I wrote a paper on segregation, believe it or not, in South Africa. Because in my home, we had more of a counter press, whether it was a socialist or a communist or what have you. So I knew that in South Africa, life was miserable. I wrote a paper in the 7th grade, and I was flunked because I didn't use the New York Times as a source. I used the Compass, the PM, the Daily Worker, whatever paper, okay? So the elite was telling us, no, South Africa is hunky-dory. Right. South Africa is a good place.
There's no dispute. We're going to end this segment and do one more. This is segment number 6 at The Real News. I'm Chris Hedges. We've been speaking with Robert Scheer, the author of They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. And thank you for joining us on The Real News. Hi, I'm Chris Hedges for The Real News. This is our 7th segment with Robert Scheer, the author of They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. Welcome, Bob. So we were talking about violence, and I just want to say that up until, let's say, the 60s, within this country, and this goes all the way back to westward expansion and even the colonization of New England, most segments of this population had a vested interest in the tools of subjugation of Native Americans and African Americans because it made them wealthier. And we watched that growing capacity of wealth. This was something that Tocqueville noticed when he made his travels across the United States. And therefore, I would disagree with you in saying that I think most segments of the population did not ask the hard questions about slavery or about the genocidal campaign. Roughly 2 million Native Americans by 1900. There's less than 250,000 left who were slaughtered because it was in their interests. As soon as gold is found, in California, they're racing through Indian territory, or gold is found in the Black Hills. The press, most of these campaigns that were carried out, like Covington out of Denver, they weren't even soldiers. They were private militias who went in and carried out indiscriminate slaughter against Native Americans. So I think it's a bit like Nazi Germany. The idea that somehow people are manipulated. Yes, of course, propaganda, the elites always manipulate, but I think it was in their interest to be manipulated in many cases, and therefore they didn't ask the kinds of questions they should have asked. I think they're far more complicit than you give them, than you give allowance for.
Yeah, this is a fundamental disagreement we have. I just think, my own parents and, going to work and the kinds of jobs. My father was, running knitting machines, and my uncle was a welder and so forth. I'm just thinking of those jobs and how much discretionary time you had. How much, you go and it's early in the morning, 5 or 6 o'clock, and you get on that subway train, and I'm sure there's a comparable farmland experience. I didn't grow up in it, but my father was a German farmer who came here at the time of the First World War and so forth. But, you go to work and you're running this machine, and then maybe you get a half hour for lunch or something, and then maybe you want to do something nice. If you're younger, you go hear some music or do something, but then you got to get back on that train and you work. And then you got to get up and do it the next day. And maybe on the weekend you can go a little fishing or have a picnic or something. I see that in Los Angeles right now. My son is married to a woman from Oaxaca. I've experienced immigrant culture, and we are increasingly in California and in the nation. We have major influx of immigrants. They're mostly interested in survival, in family, in caring for others and so forth. And the daily routine is a nightmare. If you get, and right now in Los Angeles, and you get a ticket because that's going to support municipal government, and it ends up being a $100 ticket or something, boom, there goes the budget.
Well, that's how the system's designed.
Yeah,
it's designed like that.
I understand that, but my view is these people have I will not blame them. I blame them, even when they are so-called populist movements. There's a Father Coughlin, there's the Koch brothers,
right.
There's people manipulating them, there's money pouring in. We saw it with Occupy. There are agents of the state coming in. There's the false divide and conquer, Oh, there are terrorists out there, and there are communists out there. There's foreign enemy, national security. And then we buy people off, go into the military, be cannon fodder. And I just come from a very strong sense that throughout the world, and I've seen it everywhere, that I've been, the masses of people are manipulated.
Well, I don't disagree.
Okay, and their ability, so I put the onus on the manipulators because I see, and just in my own case, even myself going to school, I remember the first time I wrote a letter to the New York Times, and they had a whole thing about, the Cold War started because the Russians grabbed southern Sakhalin. And I happened to go to the 42nd Street Library because I could do it. I had some job working in a store, Klein's on Union Square, and I went and checked this out. And then I found the wartime agreements. No, they were supposed to go get southern Sakhalin. And I wrote a letter to the New York Times. The New York Times didn't print it. Fast forward, I'm the editor of Ramparts. Martin Luther King gives that great speech at Riverside Church, and he criticized him. The New York Times doesn't print his speech. We printed it at Ramparts, and they condemn him editorially for dividing the civil rights movement. So what I have seen in my life as a journalist, as a young person and everything, was a pattern, and this is why I wrote this bloody book, because I think now with the new tools of surveillance, and being able to compare our biometrics, and with Facebook being able to move the discussion from pessimistic to optimistic, with somebody like Barack Obama coming into power because he was able to use all of this data to target advertising, I see a lessening of the ability of most people to be able to know what's going on, to challenge
all of that's true. And yet, I think we, as an imperial power, are infected with the disease of imperialism. And imperial power is primarily about the violent subjugation of others, abroad and at home. And we have, we have become the richest nation on the planet through the suffering of the wretched of the earth. And it is not in our interest, economically, however hard we may work, whatever, to look at the wretched of the earth.
See, I disagree. I think it's the interest of American workers to look at the exploitation of Chinese workers now. Because if they would, in these trade agreements, and you've written about this, in these trade agreements, if they would support these agreements, including the right of people to organize unions and have basic human rights and so forth, you wouldn't be able to keep wages as suppressed as they are in China.
You're exactly right, but I'm talking about now we're living in a system that's supranational. These global corporations have no loyalty to any sovereign state. But so I'm talking about, and you're right, but in the past.
In the past, who paid the price for these wars? I think of, who were the ones who actually ended up dying in these wars?
Well, of course, as always, it's the working class and the poor.
So I don't accept the idea that somehow we were living high off the hog because we didn't get the goodies. I disagree with that.
But look at the 1950s. The average American worker within anywhere on the planet was, in relative terms to other workers, making more than anyone. I mean,
I was working in the post office in the 1950s. That's how I went to college. And yes, I made $2.20 an hour. I was a temporary part-time sub, but I worked 12 hours a day if I could get the hours. And, I wasn't starving or anything, but I certainly was not living high.
Yeah, but right. But
no,
Bob,
wait a minute. My mother was going to work in the garment. I remember this very well. When I went to college, I was living with my mother in the Bronx. She was going to the garment district, and I was going down to work in the post office after school. And I worked my tail off with a lot of people who had been vets in the Army and everything else. They thought they were middle class, or lower middle class, but they were hanging on by a thread. And the only reason the post office job meant anything at all is we had the beginnings of unions, and the people all in my family were working. They weren't living high on the hog.
Right. Well, of course, unions created the middle class. And my grandfather worked in the post office and was a vet and was in a union and retired with a pension. And you're right, he didn't have much money. He was probably, lower working class, whatever.
Your father didn't have much money. And
no, this is my mother. My father came from money, but not my mother didn't.
But as a minister, he didn't
No,
make
he didn't make much.
No.
But you had a pension, you had a house. Now, as Barbara Ehrenreich said, working poor in this country is one long emergency. You're working 3 jobs, you're in debt, in real terms, your wages have declined or stagnated since the 70s. You can't afford a house. You're sleeping in your car.
Absolutely.
It's a completely different scenario.
No, not completely different.
No, it's very different.
No. See, this is this is where I disagree. It was never good to work in a factory. I did some of this. It was not. I was in a Fairless steel plant. I was working on the original Levittown houses in Pennsylvania because as a kid you got those kind of jobs, and even later. And my relatives worked in those jobs. No, it was never great to climb in and out of cars on the assembly line, at Ford or something. But you're right. With unionization, with some labor protections before they were stripped away, you could have a decent life with public schools that worked. Right. And I'll tell you something. I'm going to agree with you. Colin Powell wrote an autobiography, and it happened that he grew up in a part of the Bronx where I grew up, and his family was very similar and had similar jobs, and we both were in the same class at City College. Okay, we're studying engineering. I wasn't a friend or anything, but I got to talk to him about it later in life. He wrote an autobiography about this period, and where you're absolutely right, what was done for us as working class kids is not done for kids now. The schools.
Well, and let me be clear.
Yes.
You talk about City College. Who destroyed City College? Rockefeller.
Yes, absolutely.
Destroyed it. And it was one of the great colleges in the country.
Yes. City College originally had free textbooks, no tuition. Now, even if you go to any of the public universities,
not only that, in terms of the quality of the education, it equaled any college around the country.
Right, well, superior, I would say.
Well, it was certainly a major university.
We thought we were better than Harvard, but anyway. But if you look at the quality of public schools and the enthusiasm, the optimism about certainly inner city schools in America, that has been taken away. So here I will agree with you emphatically that the opportunities, such as yes, they have been stripped away.
Well, but that's the point.
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, that's the point. So I'm not pretending that working in a factory was any fun.
What I'm disagreeing is that the amount that we didn't benefit from imperialism. I disagree. The rich benefited from imperialism.
Well, disproportionately, the rich benefited from imperialism.
No, we benefited from labor unions. We benefited from our ability to organize. We benefited from the fact that our government was involved in a worldwide struggle to prove
communism, which meant they could, as soon as the Cold War is over, it means we can treat the people any way we want.
Right,
and the fact is, they had to be careful. They had to allow unions. They had to allow the working class to achieve a modicum where they could buy a house and they could retire.
And they had to desegregate.
Right.
They had to
And
desegregate.
once the
That
Cold
the
War
big
was
thing.
over, they didn't have to.
You're
And so
right.
they didn't.
You're right.
So I think that we have to make that dividing line. I don't want to romanticize what it was like, and my mother's family was, you know, working class and lower working class, so I know how they struggled. And yet, compared, I mean, my grandfather, you know, today would never have the economic security, however minimal that was,
You're absolutely right.
that he has now, and that's an important distinction.
It's a very important distinction. And let me say something, by the way, this growing income inequality has been bipartisan.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is what is so bizarre about the election we're moving into is here the choice is between two groups that participated in the destruction
That's right.
of that
Well,
safety net.
Clinton did more to destroy the working class
Yeah,
in this country
I mean,
than
do we
Ronald
have-
Reagan.
Yes, yes. Reagan at the end, because of the savings and loan crisis at the end of his term, and this I document in the last book, did actually go for increased regulation. And look, I remember, and maybe this is a good point, and just so we don't have any illusions, I remember going down to Arkansas to interview Clinton when he was running for president. And there was a program called Project Success, which was his welfare reform. And it was a Potemkin village. It never happened. And I remember
He destroyed welfare.
he destroyed it. And so, yes, this is a question to ask, you know, for those who are supporting Hillary Clinton now, why was the aid to families with dependent children, 70% were children in need, and that program was destroyed when you folks were in the White House, and you never said a word against it. Yes.
Well, and the whole prison population exploded under the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill under Clinton. And so I think those distinctions between the working class then and now are important. And I think that, you know, you have families that were kind of basically holding it together, but they were able to hold it together. They can't hold it together anymore. And what happens when you sink to that kind of despair, and I'll go back to Yugoslavia, is that you have a legitimate rage, which, as you point out, is then manipulated by elites. But what it does is it rents the society apart, because a certain segment, through propaganda, without question, that rage is then directed against the vulnerable. That's how fascism works. And unfortunately, given the nature of our country and the kind of undercurrent of racism which still exists in this country, very deep, let's look at undocumented workers. Undocumented, they are invisible people. We walk by them every day. They have no rights. They're physically abused. Their families are broken apart, and we just walk by them like they don't exist. And we all see them. They're all around us. I mean, we're talking about, they're not even second-class citizens. They're not citizens. They're not even within the rights of the law, even human beings. In many states, they can't even get driver's license. They can't.
And they feed us. They raise
what do you mean they do all of the labor? They work in construction, they work in the hotel industry, they work in the garment, everywhere else. And so the idea, we're not the country we were. We have become something really frightening. And I blame the American public, because I think that there's a willful kind of blindness, and we can just take the case of African Americans in this country. The two-thirds, the bottom two-thirds or three-quarters are living worse than when King marched in Selma. The civil rights was a legal victory, but it was never an economic victory, and King understood that if there was no economic justice, there was no racial justice.
Yeah, when King was killed, it was because he was in
with
Memphis
the poor,
to support the
right.
striking garbage workers
right.
and the war on poverty.
And so I think that we have to acknowledge that we are not working within the same paradigm that we're working in.
But you have to understand, we only have a minute. Let's get back to my book. Okay, the reason I write books, and I assume you do, is that I think there is sufficient space in this society to organize. And I think it's a cop-out if people think the game is so rigged and it's so bad, there's nothing you can do. I think the Occupy movement was an incredibly successful movement.
I do too.
Successful. And raising an issue that cannot be ignored, that you cannot have a representative republic, and if the people do not have the means to have a decent life and survive and think. I agree with that. My concern, and the reason I wrote this book on surveillance, is I think that people of power in this country are afraid of most Americans.
Of course.
They're afraid of their organizing. They don't want them to be.
Well, we're in total agreement.
Okay. And so I think my concern is that people will be more intimidated than they are now when they're observed, when they're watched.
You're right.
Okay. And
That's why they built it.
That's right. And so I want to challenge it.
I do too, but we're not going to challenge it by voting. We're going to challenge it by building mass organizations with a radical agenda that disrupts the system to such an extent that we can begin to break it down. But it's not, voting for Hillary Clinton or some other Democratic candidate. These people are, I think you would agree, as complicit in building, supporting, and sustaining this system. And as you said, I think off camera correctly, that it isn't just Hillary Clinton hates Snowden. They would like him to be killed because he has exposed their utter bankruptcy and given us a window into who these people really are.
I don't think there's any question, but let me defend being involved with elections. I don't think it should become the be-all and end-all. But I would like to see someone like a Bernie Sanders run. I forget her name, the woman who's on the city council.
Shama Sawant.
Yeah, but I was on a show with her. If she would run against Hillary Clinton, I'd vote for her in a minute. And I think elections are an attempt to at least can raise issues. And I think there are some issues that are going to be raised in this election. But
I think elections without movements are futile.
Well, but
without movements.
It's not an either or. I can tell you, I ran for Congress, and I mentioned this on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, and I was shot down by, some people who said, well, that was 50 years. Okay, but I ran in Oakland and Berkeley, and I raised the question. I said, end the war in Vietnam, end poverty in Oakland. And obviously, we didn't succeed, but we did succeed in getting rid of a Democratic hack that wasn't addressing either of those questions, and electing Ron Dellums, because I got 45% of the vote, and we were able to get him elected, and Ron Dellums ended up being the conscience of the Congress.
Because there were movements, Bob.
Yes.
There was an anti-war movement.
Well, that's why I write a book. That's why you're back. I'm trying to help a movement get going.
Well,
here.
We are total agreement.
Yeah.
And I think that every totalitarian country I've covered, from Syria to Iraq, they've all had elections. And I'm not saying don't vote. I mean, I voted for Joe Stein, as you know. I worked for Nader. I wrote his speeches for him in 2008. But if we don't build radical movements to push back, mass movements that defy the system and understand how dark that system has become, we're finished.
I agree with that.
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Hedges for The Real News. I've been speaking with the great journalist Robert Scheer, the author of a tremendous book, They Know Everything About You, How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.